Fascinating conversation we're having here. Thank you very much for your engagement. I want to bring in a lot of what we've brought to the foreground now. So the reconstruction and development, which was an important element in the white paper in 1997, and we've compared it to where we are now. We've certainly spoken about access. We've certainly spoken about the socioeconomic challenges that this country continues to face, and of course the difficulty in having particularly private higher education elements playing in this space. Take all of that, where we do need to address concerns for South Africa. At the same time, we have to be global players, because the people we're graduating have to have the requisite skill and qualification to, if they choose to, go and work anywhere in the world. How do you add those ingredients to your recipe, Rob, and still bring out a beautiful cake?
Sure. I think it's a difficult one to navigate, but I think one of the ways that institutions can explore is international accreditations. What that does for students, of course, is it indicates to them that qualifications that they're receiving is recognized outside of the South African context, and that kind of sets in some ways a trajectory open up for them on that basis. But I think there has to be more done in terms of how institutions are creating relationships with other institutions outside of the country, and that internationalization thing is tricky in our country because it's also governed by policy and what's permissible and what's not permissible. And I think there are still some very tight limitations on what we can and can't do, and that has a limiter then in terms of what higher education can achieve in terms of ensuring that we're aware of how our qualifications, of how our institutions are positioned internationally as well. So I think those are just some of the factors that we're having to navigate, and they're not easy.
And yet, Divya, a lot of those collaborations and agreements happen generally with the global West. We have universities that are in partnerships more with universities in Europe and in America than the African continent, and some would argue not enough with the East.
That's true. I think a lot of it had to do first with legacy. Many of the institutions from the global north, Europe particularly, had footprints around, or there were partnerships, or there were cooperations, and that's what started. And it was very much part of following the Eurocentric train. I mean, we always thought that the north was better. I'm not sure that is still the case. I still believe that there is that focus, also because of the funding. There's significant funding partnerships for international research between European countries and us, and that is available. And so if you're chasing research funding, you are looking at those possible opportunities. But what I'm finding is, particularly with the issue around decoloniality, the focus on Africanization, the stronger focus on a transformation agenda, depending on the institution and where it's coming from, there's a very deliberate focus on partnerships in Africa, establishing partnerships in Africa. I will say that sometimes, though, when you talk about a partnership in Africa, sadly, people still look at you as if that's a very third-rate partnership that you're going after. And I'm happy to say I think we've proved them wrong in many instances with the exchanges that we've been able to. And you can have quality exchanges. I think the East is growing, but the East is difficult. It's trying to establish relationships, and I can say just our example. China has one of the biggest and the best police colleges in the world, apparently, on paper. And we've reached out at so many different opportunities, and they've got to jump through so many hoops before they can partner with us. So I'd be I don't know enough to talk about partnering with the India's much easier. Coming from UNISA, there were many partnerships that were established with India. They're very open to partnerships, and I think that's an emerging space. So I think there's a transition from the strict focus. It also depends on the institution. Some institutions come with a history of wanting to focus on the North.
Fair enough. Let's talk about the research output in this country, Rian. Firstly, how are we doing, I suppose, is an obvious question, but also who should be setting the research output goals?
We're doing shockingly. It's in 2022 we had a 62% increase in patent registrations in Africa. Really exciting. They were all from China. Yeah. So the point is, we're not registering our own patents here. We are patent empty, and I don't know what we're doing in the higher education space, because every single PhD thesis that gets put through gets signed, that you're giving the IP over to government, and that, but I don't see any of that being commercialized. Any is a strong word, but proportionately, the sheer throughput of PhD graduates. First, I question the Department of Statistics. I think it's very idealistic what they're saying that they're doing, because they claim certain numbers, which if you add it up, it just doesn't make sense. But we can talk about that. That's not a new trick. But at this point in time, we're lucky if we graduate 2,000 PhDs per annum. Okay.
And is that a small number?
That's a massively small number.
What should be the ideal number?
I don't know, maybe 1 million across the continent. We're one of the largest contributors in the continent of PhDs, and we are at an extremely low level.
The NDP is 5,000 per annum, isn't it? The NDP target.
Yeah, which is still, I mean, that was it's mind-blowing that it can be that low.
But wait a minute, if it's 5,000 in 5-6 years and we're only graduating about 2,000, we're not even meeting, we're running the risk of not meeting that goal.
If we do not enroll 2,000 PhDs by next year, they will not be finished by 2030. It's impossible. Okay. So we will not meet the PhD target. Okay. So if I had to rate a PhD target on a scale of, or the research output target on a scale of 0 to 10, I would put it at maximum 2. Okay.
Why are we not performing better in the PhD space,
Well,
Gloria?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one of the key reasons is that many PhD candidates are actually employed, so they can't afford to be full-time students. There's no funding. For example, in America, you are employed when you're a doctoral student, and you earn a salary, and you have
From the university.
Yeah, and you have health benefits and so on. So you can have your family, and you teach and so on, and you get your PhD. In South Africa, you know, I can give you an example of somebody I know, my own daughter, who was a PhD candidate at a public university, not the one I work at, and and she was working, she was teaching almost a full load, and I think she was getting 10,000 rand a month. Now, luckily, she can handle that. Why? Because, you know, generational privilege. You know what I mean? So, for a lot of students, we find a lot of, for example, if you look at the national system, a lot of the postdoctoral research fellows are not South African because the funding doesn't cover basic living expenses. So we speak the desire, but then there's not the finance to support it. So so of course universities do make their own arrangements, they support, they augment the funding, etc. But I mean, that's one big factor. And then I think the other big factor is that there are limited positions for somebody with a PhD. So if your goal is to become an academic, well, There's really, you know, you take that PhD and then there are only so many jobs, and, you know, you have to wait for somebody to die or retire to get a job. You know what I'm saying? So there's all these constraints.
Should we